If I pay, can you scare my monsters? Girl asked Hell's Angel. He sat down like one was in him too. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the suburban street as Jack Rusty Callahan nursed his coffee on the corner of Maple and Fourth. His weathered leather jacket creaked as he shifted on the concrete, finding a more comfortable position against the brick wall of Pete's corner store. The warmth from the paper cup seeped into his calloused hands, bringing a slight comfort to his tired bones. At 45, Jack wore his years like battle scars. His thick beard, peppered with gray, couldn't hide the hard lines etched into his face. Faded tattoos peeked out from beneath his collar and sleeves, remnants of a life he'd left behind but couldn't completely erase. The neighborhood residents gave him a wide berth as they passed, mothers pulling their children closer, men averting their eyes. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He didn't blame them. He knew what they saw. A hulking figure who looked like trouble, someone who didn't belong in their peaceful little town with its neat gardens and white picket fences. Jack took another sip of his coffee, savoring the bitter taste and the quiet moment. These peaceful afternoons had become his refuge, a far cry from the chaos of his past life. The gentle breeze carried the scent of Mrs. Henderson's roses from across the street, mixed with the aroma of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the block. Jack closed his eyes, letting the suburban symphony wash over him. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the distant laughter of children playing in their yards. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed her, a tiny figure standing a few feet away, shifting from one foot to another, clutching something in her small hand. Her dark pigtails bounced as she gathered her courage, and Jack found himself holding his breath, wondering what this little girl could want with someone like him. She wore a pink dress with cartoon unicorns, and her sneakers lit up with each nervous step she took toward him. Despite his intimidating appearance, she seemed more determined than scared. Jack remained perfectly still, not wanting to frighten her away. "Excuse me, mister." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but clear enough to catch his attention. Jack cleared his throat, trying to soften his naturally gruff voice. "Yes." She took another step closer, revealing what she'd been holding, a crumpled dollar bill, probably saved from her allowance or found between couch cushions. Her big brown eyes met his, full of hope and trust that made his heart clench unexpectedly. "I see you here every day," she said, gaining confidence. "You look really strong and brave." Jack blinked, surprised by her words. It had been a long time since anyone had seen anything in him besides danger. "What's your name, little one?" "Sophie," she replied, straightening up like she was introducing herself at school. "I'm 5. She held out the wrinkled dollar bill with both hands, as if making an offering. Her next words caught him completely off guard. "If I pay you, can you scare my monsters?" Jack stared at the dollar, then at Sophie's earnest face. His heart, hardened by years of violence and regret, seemed to crack just a little. In this moment, he wasn't an ex-gang member or a social outcast. He was simply a man being asked by a child to be her protector. He gently accepted the dollar, careful not to frighten her with any sudden movements. "Monsters, huh?" Sophie fidgeted with the hem of her dress, looking up at Jack with those big brown eyes that seemed to see right through his rough exterior. "There are monsters in my room," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "They come out when it's dark, and they hide in the closet and under my bed." Jack set his coffee cup down beside him, giving Sophie his full attention. The way she described her fears reminded him of his own childhood, though his monsters had been far more real than imaginary creatures in the dark. "Your parents can't help with these monsters?" he asked carefully, keeping his voice gentle. Sophie's shoulders slumped. "Mommy says they're not real, but I can hear them at night." She scuffed her light-up sneaker against the sidewalk. "And she works a lot. Sometimes she's too tired to check under the bed again." Jack ran a hand through his beard, studying the little girl before him. Despite his intimidating appearance, she showed no fear of him, only trust and hope that he could solve her problem. It was strange how children could sometimes see past the surface that adults found so frightening. "What about your dad?" The question came out before he could stop himself. "He travels for work," Sophie said matter-of-factly, as if she'd explained this many times before. Besides, the monsters are really sneaky. They only come out when everyone else is sleeping. A cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and Sophie hugged herself, though Jack suspected it wasn't from the cold. He knew he should probably tell her to run along home, that a strange man wasn't the right person to help with her monster problem. But something in her expression, that mix of vulnerability and determination, struck a chord deep within him. "These monsters," Jack said, leaning forward slightly. "What do they look like?" Sophie's eyes widened, grateful that someone was finally taking her seriously. "They're big and scary," she said, stretching her arms out wide, "with sharp teeth and glowing eyes. Sometimes they scratch at the walls." Jack nodded solemnly, remembering how real such fears had seemed when he was young. "That does sound pretty scary. But you're not scared of anything," Sophie said with complete conviction. "I've watched you. You're always so brave, sitting here by yourself. The monsters would run away if they saw you." Her words hit him hard. If only she knew how many things he feared, how many demons from his past kept him awake at night. But here was this little girl, seeing strength where others saw danger, finding courage where others saw threat. Jack looked at the crumpled dollar bill in his hand. It probably represented her entire savings, offered up with complete faith that he could help her. The trust in her eyes made his chest tight with an unfamiliar feeling. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose I could take a look at these monsters of yours." Sophie's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You'll help me?" "I'll do my best," Jack said, tucking the dollar carefully into his jacket pocket. "But I'll need to see where these monsters are hiding." "Our house is just down the street," Sophie said eagerly, pointing toward a row of modest homes. "You can come right now. Please." Jack walked beside Sophie, matching his long strides to her small steps. The little girl skipped occasionally, her pigtails bouncing with each hop. She chatted about her favorite stuffed animals and how they help keep watch for monsters. But Jack's attention drifted as they approached the corner of Maple and Oak. This street held memories he'd tried hard to forget. 10 years ago, he'd roared down this same sidewalk on his motorcycle, leather cuts displaying the Hell's Angels patches, leading a pack of riders who treated these quiet streets like their personal playground. The thunder of engines had shattered the peace back then, sending mothers rushing to grab their children from front yards. "Are you listening, Mr. Jack?" Sophie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Sorry, kiddo. Just thinking about something." He tugged at his beard, a nervous habit he'd developed since leaving the club. They passed the old Murphy's gas station, now a convenience store with fresh paint and bright signs. Jack remembered the night everything changed. The sound of breaking glass, angry shouts, the sick feeling in his stomach as things went too far. He'd watched his brothers cross a line he couldn't follow, and that night had been his last with the club. Sophie reached up and slipped her small hand into his calloused one. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, it made his throat tight. Here was this innocent child, holding the hand that had once thrown punches in street fights and gripped handlebars during high-speed chases. "My house has a red door," Sophie announced proudly. "Mommy painted it herself last summer." They turned onto Willow Street, lined with modest homes and well-tended gardens. Jack's boots felt heavier with each step. The neighborhood had changed in the decades since he'd last visited. New fences, different cars and driveways, trees grown taller. But the memories remained sharp as ever. "See, there it is." Sophie pointed excitedly. The small house at the end of the street came into view. It was a simple one-story with white siding and, true to Sophie's word, a bright red door. Flower boxes hung beneath windows, bursting with colorful petunias. A worn bicycle lay on its side in the front yard. Jack's steps slowed. The last time he'd stood in front of this house, he'd been a different man. Young, angry, full of misplaced pride and rebellion. The red door had been green then, but the rest was exactly as he remembered. Even the crack in the concrete path leading to the porch remained, like a scar that refused to fade. Sophie tugged at his hand. "Come on, we have to check for monsters before it gets dark." Jack's chest tightened. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, that this was where Sophie lived. Of all the houses in town, of all the doors he could have ended up standing before, it had to be this one. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. The familiar ache of old guilt settled in his stomach as they approached the house. Sophie bounded ahead, her sneakers lighting up with each step on the concrete path, while Jack followed more slowly, his past and present colliding with each footfall. Sophie pushed open the red door, its hinges creaking softly. "Mommy, I'm home." Her voice rang through the small entryway as she kicked off her light-up sneakers. Jack hesitated at the threshold, his large frame filling the doorway. The house smelled of fresh laundry and something sweet, maybe cookies. Photos lined the walls, marking the stages of Sophie's young life. His eyes caught glimpses of birthday parties, first days of school, and holiday celebrations. "Sophie, where have you been? I was getting worried." A familiar voice called from the living room. Jack's heart skipped a beat. That voice, he knew that voice. His hands grew clammy, and he fought the urge to turn and run. But Sophie was already pulling him forward by his sleeve, eager to show him the monsters in her room. They rounded the corner into the living room, and there she was. Amanda sat on a worn beige couch, a basket of unfolded laundry beside her. Her dark hair was shorter now, streaked with bits of silver at the temples. She wore simple jeans and a faded blue t-shirt, but to Jack, she looked just as beautiful as she had 10 years ago. The moment she saw him, the laundry she'd been folding slipped from her hands. "Jack!" His name came out as barely more than a whisper. Time seemed to freeze. Jack stood rooted to the spot, his massive frame somehow making him feel more exposed and protected. The leather jacket he wore felt too tight, too heavy. He watched as shock, recognition, and something else, was it fear, crossed Amanda's face. Sophie, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, bounced excitedly. "Mommy, this is Mr. Jack. I found him sitting outside the coffee shop." She held up her crumpled dollar bill proudly. "He's going to help me with the monsters in my room." Amanda's eyes darted between her daughter and Jack, her expression a complex mixture of disbelief and concern. Her hands automatically reached for Sophie, drawing the little girl closer to her side. "Is he now?" Her voice was careful, measured. "Yeah, he looks really scary, doesn't he?" Sophie grinned up at Jack. "That's why I picked him. The monsters won't stand a chance." Jack shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing against the hardwood floor. He cleared his throat, but couldn't find the right words. What could he possibly say to the woman he'd left behind all those years ago? Amanda's fingers absently stroked Sophie's hair, a gesture that seemed more for her own comfort than her daughter's. Her eyes never left Jack's face, searching for something. Maybe traces of the man she used to know, or signs of the man he'd become. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can Mr. Jack see my room now? The monsters come out when it gets dark." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, but neither adult acknowledged it. Instead, they maintained their silent exchange, years of unspoken words passing between them in that single look. Amanda's eyes held questions, warnings, and maybe even a hint of the old pain. Jack's gaze carried regret, uncertainty, and a desperate need to prove he wasn't the same man who'd roared away on his motorcycle a decade ago. "Mommy!" Sophie's voice finally broke through the heavy silence. Amanda blinked, drawing a deep breath. Her hand tightened protectively around Sophie's shoulder, but she didn't say no. She couldn't, not with her daughter looking up at her with such hope and trust. Sophie skipped down the hallway, her small hand wrapped around Jack's calloused finger. Her ponytail bounced with each step, and Jack couldn't help but notice how her grip was completely trusting, without a hint of fear. The walls were lined with more family photos, and crayon drawings stuck to the lower half with colorful star-shaped magnets. "Here it is," Sophie announced, pushing open a door decorated with her name in purple wooden letters. Jack ducked his head to enter the room, his massive frame making everything seem smaller than it was. The space was exactly what you'd expect from a 5-year-old girl's bedroom. Walls painted a soft yellow, with butterflies and rainbows stenciled near the ceiling. Stuffed animals of every size lined a shelf above her bed, their button eyes seeming to watch his every move. A nightlight shaped like a unicorn cast a gentle glow from the corner. "This is where they hide," Sophie whispered, pointing to the space under her bed. She crouched down, her small hands gripping the edge of her rainbow bedspread. "Sometimes I hear them scratching at night." Jack knelt beside her, his leather jacket creaking. The space under the bed was dark, filled with storage boxes and forgotten toys. He could see how the shadows might play tricks on a young mind. "See that corner?" Sophie pointed to the darkest spot. "That's where the scariest one lives. He has red eyes and sharp teeth." Her voice trembled slightly. Jack sat cross-legged on the carpet, his back against her bed. Sophie immediately plopped down next to him, her shoulder pressing against his arm. The trust in her actions made his throat tight. "You know what, kiddo?" Jack's gruff voice was gentler than usual. "I've been around a long time, seen a lot of things. Want to know what I learned about monsters?" Sophie nodded eagerly, her eyes wide. "Real monsters don't live under beds." He tapped his chest. "They live in here, in the shadows of people's hearts. They're the bad choices we make, the mean things we say, the times we hurt people we care about." Sophie's forehead wrinkled in concentration. "Like when I pushed Tommy at recess because he took my crayon?" Jack smiled slightly. "Something like that. But you know what else? Just like you can choose to be nice instead of pushing, people can choose not to let their monsters control them." He thought about his own past, the decisions that had led him away from Amanda years ago. "But what about the scratching sounds?" Sophie persisted. "Tomorrow, I'll come back," Jack promised, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "We'll check every corner, every shadow. I'll show you there's nothing to be afraid of." He paused, looking at her earnest face. "And I'll help you be brave enough to face any monster, real or not." Sophie beamed at him, relief evident in her small features. She leaned against his arm more heavily, comfortable despite his intimidating appearance. "Promise you'll come back?" "I promise, kiddo." Jack's voice was rough with emotion. "We'll make sure those monsters are gone for good." The afternoon sun streamed through Sophie's window, casting warm patches on the carpet. In that moment, surrounded by stuffed animals and rainbow decorations, Jack felt something shift inside him. This little girl's trust was a gift he hadn't earned, but one he desperately wanted to deserve. The evening sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets as Jack made his way home. His heavy boots scuffed against the concrete, each step echoing the turmoil in his mind. The peaceful neighborhood felt surreal after the afternoon's unexpected encounter. Amanda, after all these years, she still had the same effect on him. The way she'd looked at him, part recognition, part fear, part something else he couldn't quite name, made his chest tighten. Her face had gained a few lines, but her eyes were just as he remembered them, deep brown and filled with quiet strength. A car drove past, and Jack instinctively adjusted his leather jacket, aware of how out of place he must look in this tidy suburb. The driver gave him a wide berth, probably intimidated by his appearance. He was used to that reaction, had even cultivated it during his years with the Angels. But today, for the first time in a long while, it bothered him. Sophie's face floated through his thoughts, her innocent trust, the way she looked up at him with complete faith that he could chase away her fears. No one had looked at him like that in years. Most people crossed the street when they saw him coming. Monsters under the bed. He muttered to himself, shaking his head. If only life's demons were that simple to chase away. His own monsters wore different faces: regret, violence, betrayal. The things he'd done, the people he'd hurt, the life he'd walked away from. The streets grew more familiar as he approached his neighborhood, the neat houses giving way to apartment buildings with peeling paint. A group of teenagers lounged on a corner, but they straightened up and went quiet when they saw him approach. His reputation still carried weight, even if he'd left that life behind. Jack's apartment building loomed ahead, a tired three-story walk-up with rusty fire escapes zigzagging down its face. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his key sliding into the lock with a familiar scratch. Inside, the apartment was sparse but clean. No photos on the walls, no decorations, just the basics. A worn couch faced a small TV, and the kitchenette held only the essentials. It was a place to sleep, nothing more. Jack shed his jacket, draping it over a kitchen chair. From the pocket of his jeans, he pulled out his wallet. Behind his driver's license, tucked away where he rarely looked, was a creased photograph. He settled onto the couch and stared at the image. In it, a younger version of himself smiled at the camera. No beard then, fewer lines around his eyes. His arm was wrapped around Amanda's waist, and she was laughing at something off camera. They looked happy, carefree. It was taken before everything went wrong, before the Angels became his new family, before the violence took over his life. The photo trembled slightly in his hands. Sophie had her mother's smile, that same brightness that had once lit up his world. How had everything gone so wrong? How had he let himself become the very thing he'd always sworn he wouldn't be? Jack sat there in the growing darkness, the photo in his hands, while outside his window, the city settled into night. The weight of the past pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. The morning sun warmed Jack's shoulders as he walked up the familiar path to Sophie's house. His boots, usually heavy with the weight of his past, felt lighter today. He'd spent most of the night thinking about Sophie's monsters, and he'd come prepared with a plan. Amanda's car was missing from the driveway. A babysitter, a teenage girl with bright pink hair, answered the door. She recognized Jack from Amanda's description and let him in, explaining she had homework to do in the kitchen. Jack, Sophie's excited voice carried down the hallway. She came running, her brown pigtails bouncing, wearing mismatched socks and a purple butterfly t-shirt. You came back. I promised, didn't I? Jack's gruff voice softened as he looked down at her beaming face. And I brought something. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small flashlight keychain. Sophie's eyes widened as he handed it to her. Monsters hate light, he explained, settling down cross-legged on her bedroom floor. They can't stand it. Sophie turned the flashlight over in her small hands. Really? She clicked it on and off, watching the beam dance across the wall. Really? Jack nodded solemnly. But you know what they hate even more? Brave little girls who aren't afraid to fight back. Sophie sat down across from him, her expression serious. Can you teach me how to fight them? That's why I'm here. Jack watched as she arranged her stuffed animals in a circle around them. What's this? It's our monster fighting arena. Sophie explained, positioning her teddy bear just so. The animals help us. They're our army. Jack couldn't help but smile. Good thinking. Every warrior needs backup. For the next hour, they played Sophie's game. She'd point to different shadows in her room, declaring the monsters, and together they'd devise strategies to defeat them. Jack found himself fully immersed in her world, where the space under the bed became a dragon's lair, and the closet housed a friendly ghost who helped them catch the bad monsters. The worst one lives there, Sophie whispered, pointing to the corner where her bookshelf cast a long shadow. He comes out at night when I'm trying to sleep. Jack leaned in close. Want to know a secret about monsters? Sophie nodded eagerly. They're all bullies, and bullies are always scared of something themselves. That's why they try to scare others. Sophie considered this, clutching her stuffed giraffe. What are they scared of? Love, Jack said simply, and kindness, and brave little girls who have good hearts. They continued playing, Jack following Sophie's lead as she created elaborate battle plans involving her toys. Her imagination transformed the ordinary bedroom into a magical fortress. Gradually, her movements slowed, her voice grew softer. Maybe we should take a break, Jack suggested, noticing her drooping eyelids. Sophie crawled on her bed, but her small hand reached out to grab Jack's sleeve. Stay, she asked sleepily. Just until the monsters know you're here? Jack settled into the chair beside her bed. I'll stay, he promised. Within minutes, Sophie was asleep, her hand still holding onto his sleeve. Jack sat perfectly still, watching her peaceful face. The afternoon sun filtered through her curtains, casting warm patterns across the floor. In the quiet room, with Sophie's gentle breathing and complete trust in him, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. He looked down at her small hand on his sleeve and felt the weight of his new purpose. This little girl believed in him, trusted him to keep her safe from the shadows that frightened her. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack felt truly needed. The evening air had turned crisp when Jack approached Sophie's house the next day. The porch light cast a warm glow, and through the front window, he could see movement inside. His boots felt heavy again as he climbed the steps, each footfall echoing his uncertainty. Before he could knock, the door swung open. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stood in the doorway, his presence filling the frame. Daniel Callahan's eyes narrowed as he took in Jack's appearance. The leather jacket, the tattoos visible at his neck, the thick beard that couldn't quite hide the hard years etched into his face. "Can I help you?" Daniel's voice was clipped, professional but cold. Jack cleared his throat. "I'm here to see Sophie. Amanda knows I'm coming." "Does she now?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He stood straighter, using his height to look down at Jack. "And you are?" "Jack Callahan." The words felt strange in his mouth, sharing a last name with this man who represented everything he wasn't: success, respectability, clean living. "Daddy." Sophie's voice rang out from behind Daniel. She squeezed past her father's legs and beamed up at Jack. "You came back." Daniel's hand came down protectively on Sophie's shoulder. "Sophie, honey, go to your room for a minute. I need to talk to Mr. Callahan." "But Daddy, he's here to help with the monsters." Sophie protested, her small face scrunching up in confusion. "The monsters?" Daniel's eyebrows rose. He studied Jack more carefully now, his expression a mix of concern and suspicion. "What exactly is this about?" Jack shifted his weight, feeling the familiar defensiveness rise in his chest. "Sophie asked for my help, with her fears about monsters in her room. That's all. And you just decided to help?" Daniel's tone made it clear he didn't believe it was that simple. "Out of the goodness of your heart." "Something like that," Jack replied, his voice growing harder. "Daddy, please." Sophie tugged at her father's sleeve. "He makes the monsters go away. He taught me how to be brave." Daniel looked down at his daughter, then back at Jack. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Jack could see the wheels turning in Daniel's head, calculating the risks, weighing his daughter's words against Jack's appearance. "Where exactly did you meet my daughter?" Daniel asked, his protective instinct evident in every word. "On Oak Street," Jack answered honestly. "She approached me." "Sophie," Daniel's voice softened as he addressed his daughter, "you know you're not supposed to talk to strangers." "But he's not a stranger anymore," Sophie insisted. "He's my monster hunter." Jack watched as Daniel's expression shifted, torn between his daughter's obvious trust and his own misgivings. The businessman's eyes scanned Jack again, taking in every detail that marked him as an outsider in this suburban world. "Amanda knows about this?" Daniel asked, his tone making it clear that the wrong answer would end this conversation immediately. "Yes," Jack said simply. "She's been home when I've visited." Sophie bounced on her toes, looking between the two men. "Can Jack stay? Please, Daddy. The monsters might come back if he doesn't help." Daniel's jaw worked as he considered. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway, though his posture remained rigid. "You can stay. For now." His eyes met Jack's with a cold, warning look. "But we'll be having a longer conversation about this very soon." Jack stepped into the living room, hyper-aware of Daniel's scrutiny. Sophie skipped around them, humming a tune to herself, seemingly oblivious to the tension between the two men. "Sophie, sweetie," Daniel called out, his voice gentle but firm. "Why don't you go play with your dolls for a bit? I need to talk to Jack." "Okay, Daddy." Sophie bounced away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As soon as she was out of earshot, Daniel's demeanor changed. He turned to face Jack, his shoulders squared. "Let's be clear about something. I know your type. I've seen enough men like you come through my office, claiming they've changed." Jack kept his eyes fixed on a spot on the carpet, his jaw clenching. The familiar anger bubbled up inside him, but he forced it down. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Daniel demanded. Jack raised his eyes slowly, meeting Daniel's stern gaze. The businessman's expression was hard, calculating. "Are you really trying to change, or is this just some game you're playing?" Daniel's words cut through the air like ice. "Because if you're using my daughter for whatever agenda you have." "I'm not using anybody," Jack snapped, his voice rougher than he intended. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. Sophie asked for my help. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. Daniel's laugh was bitter. A man with your background just happens to befriend a 5-year-old girl? You expect me to believe that? The words stung more than Jack wanted to admit. He'd been judged his whole life, but something about Daniel's accusation hit deeper. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Daniel countered. The tattoos, the jacket. You're not exactly hiding what you are, or what you were. He paused, studying Jack's face. People don't change overnight. Jack's hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening. The accusation stung, but what hurt more was the truth behind it. I'm not that person anymore, he said quietly. Really? Daniel's tone was skeptical. Because I've heard stories about your time with the Angels. The violence, the chaos you caused. How can I trust you around my family? Jack felt the familiar surge of anger rising in his chest. His old self would have lashed out, proved Daniel right with his fists. But Sophie's face flashed in his mind, and he took a deep breath instead. You're right, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. I did horrible things. I can't change that past. But I'm choosing to be different now, every single day. Words are easy, Daniel shot back. Actions are what matter. How do I know you won't snap one day, Anne? Because I love that little girl up there. Jack's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. He took another steadying breath. But you know what? You don't have to believe me. I'll prove it by walking away right now. Jack turned and headed for the front door, his heart heavy but his head held high. He stepped out onto the porch, settling heavily on the steps. The morning air felt cool against his face as he tried to calm the storm of emotions inside him. He didn't know how long he sat there before he heard the soft patter of small feet behind him. Sophie appeared at his side, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. Jack. Her voice was small but clear. I made something for you. She held out the paper, and Jack carefully took it. It was a crayon drawing of what looked like a monster, but instead of being scary, it had a big, friendly smile on its face. Above it, in wobbly letters, Sophie had written my hero. See, she said, pointing to the drawing. The monster isn't scary anymore because you helped make it nice. Just like you're nice now. Jack felt his throat tighten as he looked at the simple drawing. Leave it to a child to see what adults couldn't. That people could change, that monsters could become heroes. You're not going to leave, are you? Sophie asked, her eyes wide with concern. Jack pulled her into a gentle hug, the drawing still clutched in his hand. No, kiddo, he promised softly. I'm not going anywhere. The evening sun cast long shadows across the suburban street as Jack walked toward Daniel and Amanda's house. His boots felt heavy on the pavement, each step carrying the weight of years of mistakes. The porch light flickered on as he approached, and he could see movement behind the curtains. Jack took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. He'd traded his usual leather jacket for a clean button-down shirt, not trying to be someone he wasn't, but showing respect for the conversation ahead. He knocked on the door, his knuckles gentle against the wood. Amanda answered, surprise flickering across her face. Jack? Sophie's already asleep. I know, he said softly. I came to talk to you and Daniel, if that's okay. She hesitated, then nodded, opening the door wider. Daniel sat in the living room, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some papers. He looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. What brings you here? Daniel asked, setting his work aside. Together, they gathered candles from around the house, Jack letting Sophie hold his hand the whole time. He showed her how to carefully carry the battery-operated ones, making sure she felt like she was helping. Soon, they had created a warm circle of light in the living room. See, Jack said, settling back onto the couch. The monsters don't like it when we fight back, when we make our own light. Sophie climbed onto his lap, still jumpy from the storm, but calmer in the candlelight. Did you ever fight monsters, Jack? Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about his answer. I did, he said finally. Some of the scariest monsters I ever met were the ones inside me. The ones that told me I wasn't good enough, that I couldn't change. How'd you beat them? Sophie asked, her eyes wide with wonder. By doing what we're doing right now, he said, gesturing to the candles around them. By finding light in the darkness. by being brave enough to face them. As the storm continued to rage outside, Jack told Sophie stories about the monsters he'd faced, carefully edited versions of his past struggles, transformed into tales of courage and redemption. He told her about the monster of anger and how he learned to tame it, about the monster of fear and how facing it made it smaller. Sophie listened intently, occasionally jumping at the thunder, but growing progressively more relaxed in Jack's protective embrace. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, but they didn't seem so scary anymore. "You know what's stronger than any monster?" Jack asked softly. "What?" Sophie mumbled sleepily. "Love," he said simply. "Love and courage." Sophie's eyes grew heavy as Jack continued his stories, his deep voice mixing with the sound of rain against the windows. She curled up against his chest, feeling safe despite the storm, and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and Jack's protective presence. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Jack helped Sophie with her breakfast. Amanda stood at the counter, sipping her coffee and smiling at their interaction. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving behind a fresh, clean feeling in the air. "Can you make the pancake smile again?" Sophie asked, watching as Jack flipped another golden circle onto her plate. "Coming right up, kiddo." Jack reached for the whipped cream, drawing a goofy face that made Sophie giggle. The peaceful moment shattered when Daniel walked in, his expression stormy. He stood in the doorway, watching the domestic scene with narrowed eyes. "Amanda," Daniel said firmly, "could you take Sophie upstairs for a minute?" Amanda hesitated, glancing between Jack and Daniel. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Sophie, honey, let's go get dressed for the day." "But my pancake," Sophie started to protest. "We'll finish it later, sweetheart," Amanda said, guiding her daughter toward the stairs. Once they were gone, Daniel stepped closer to Jack. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, his voice low and controlled. "And I need to know something. Are you really different now? Or are you still the same man who used to hurt people?" Jack's throat tightened. "I was stupid. Selfish. You were," Amanda agreed. "But I wasn't completely innocent either. I knew who you were when we met. I thought I could change you." The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Jack studied his tattooed hands, remembering how they used to hold hers. "I never," Amanda's voice cracked slightly. "I never stopped caring about you, Jack. Even after everything. I'd see stories in the news about motorcycle gang violence, and my heart would stop until I knew you weren't involved." Jack looked up, meeting her eyes. The afternoon sun streaming through the window illuminated the silver strands in her hair, reminders of the years that had passed. "I didn't deserve that," he said quietly. "Your concern, your care, any of it." "No, you didn't," Amanda agreed. "But that's the thing about feelings. They don't always follow what's deserved." Jack felt the weight of her words, the truth in them piercing through his defenses. "I'm trying to be better now. For Sophie. For myself." He paused, then added softly, "For you." Amanda wiped at her eyes, brushing away tears before they could fall. "I know you are. I see it when you're with her. You're not the same man who left us." The pain in her voice matched the ache in his chest. All these years, they'd carried their wounds separately, letting them fester in silence. Now, finally speaking the truth, it hurt, but it was a clean kind of pain, like cleaning out an old injury so it could properly heal. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows of Sophie's house. Dark clouds had rolled in quickly, turning the late afternoon sky an ominous gray. Sophie pressed herself against the living room wall, her small body trembling with each flash of lightning. "Mommy," she called out, but Amanda was still at work, stuck in the storm herself. Jack, who had been reading on the couch, noticed Sophie's distress. Her face had gone pale, and her fingers clutched at the hem of her butterfly t-shirt. Another boom of thunder shook the house, and Sophie let out a frightened squeak. "Hey, kiddo," Jack said softly, setting his book aside. "It's just a storm. Nothing to be afraid of." Sophie shook her head vigorously. "The monsters come out in the dark," she whispered. "They're louder when it storms." As if nature wanted to prove her point, a brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Sophie screamed and ran to Jack, burying her face in his leather jacket. Her tiny body shook with sobs. "The monsters are coming," she cried. "They're coming to get me." Jack wrapped his arms around her protectively. "Hey now, listen to me," he said, his gruff voice gentler than usual. "Monsters only come in the dark if you let them. You know what keeps them away." Sophie looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "What?" "Being brave," Jack said, reaching into his pocket for his lighter. With a quick flick, a small flame illuminated their faces. "And having light in your heart." He stood up, keeping Sophie close. "Let's find some candles, okay? We'll make our own light." "You're right," Jack said, surprising them both with his honesty. "They don't. But that doesn't mean they can't change at all." Daniel's expression remained skeptical. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit that betrayed his own discomfort. "I've got a work event tonight. I'm letting you stay because Sophie seems to trust you and Amanda." He trailed off, leaving the connection between Jack and Amanda unspoken. But don't mistake this for approval. Jack watched as Daniel gathered his briefcase and car keys. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the light, another reminder of the gulf between their worlds. Everything about Daniel spoke of success, of respectability. Everything Jack had never managed to achieve. The guilt that Jack had been fighting rose up again, stronger this time. Daniel was right. He wasn't the kind of person who should be around kids. His past hung around his neck like a heavy chain, marking him, defining him. Daniel paused at the door, turning back one last time. "Amanda will be home in an hour. Don't make me regret this decision." With that, he was gone, leaving Jack standing alone in the living room, the weight of his history pressing down on him harder than ever. Through the window, Jack watched Daniel's expensive car pull out of the driveway. The man had every right to be suspicious, every right to protect his family. Jack knew that, but knowing it didn't make the judgment any easier to bear. The nightmare came without warning. In his sleep, Jack found himself back on his motorcycle, the thunder of engines surrounding him. The familiar weight of his old leather jacket pressed against his shoulders, heavy with the memories of violence and regret. Dark figures on bikes roared past him, their faces twisted into grotesque masks. The road stretched endlessly before him, a black ribbon leading straight to hell. The wind carried the echo of screams. People he'd hurt, lives he'd destroyed. Once a monster, always a monster, the voices whispered, growing louder with each passing moment. In the dream, his hands gripped the handlebars tighter, knuckles white beneath his tattoos. The motorcycle picked up speed, racing towards something he couldn't see but knew he didn't want to face. Suddenly, Sophie's face appeared in front of him, innocent and trusting. But his bike wouldn't stop. He was going to hurt her, just like he'd hurt everyone else. Jack bolted upright in bed, his t-shirt soaked with sweat. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to catch his breath. The digital clock on his nightstand read 3:17 a.m., its red numbers glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and buried his face in his hands. The nightmare clung to him like smoke, refusing to fade away. Every detail felt too real. The rumble of the engines, the weight of his old colors, the fear in Sophie's eyes. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, but his hands were shaking. The small apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in around him. Pictures from his past life seemed to mock him from their hiding places in drawers and closets. Jack stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. But with each step, the truth became clearer. It wasn't his past that terrified him. It was the possibility that Daniel was right. What if he couldn't change? What if the monster inside him was just waiting for the right moment to emerge? He watched the sun rise through his window, the sky gradually lightening from black to deep blue to pale pink. By 7 o'clock, he couldn't stand being inside anymore. He threw on a clean shirt and headed to the park, hoping the morning air would clear his head. The park was quiet at this hour, just a few early morning joggers and people walking their dogs. Jack found an empty bench and sat down, watching a group of sparrows hop around nearby. The peaceful scene felt surreal after his nightmare. Jack! A familiar voice cut through his thoughts. Sophie was running toward him, her mother following close behind with an apologetic look on her face. "Hey, kiddo," Jack managed, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here so early?" "Mommy takes me to the park before school sometimes," Sophie explained, climbing onto the swing next to where Jack sat. "Will you push me?" Jack glanced at Amanda, who nodded slightly. He stood up and moved behind Sophie's swing, giving it a gentle push. Her delighted giggle cut through the darkness that had been suffocating him since his nightmare. "Higher," Sophie called out, her face lit up with joy. There wasn't a trace of fear or doubt in her expression, just pure, innocent trust. Looking at her smile, Jack felt something inside him shift. The monster from his nightmare seemed smaller somehow, less powerful in the face of Sophie's unconditional acceptance. Jack sat in Amanda's living room, his large frame making the floral armchair seem smaller than it was. The ticking of the wall clock echoed through the quiet house. Sophie was at her afternoon dance class, giving him the chance he needed to finally talk with Amanda. His fingers drummed against his knee as he waited. The living room held traces of the life Amanda had built without him. Family photos on the walls, Sophie's artwork proudly displayed on the refrigerator, a neat row of chapter books on the coffee table. Everything spoke of stability, of careful choices, of love. The sound of a key in the front door made his heart jump. Amanda walked in, still in her work clothes, her purse slung over her shoulder. She stopped short when she saw him. "Jack!" Her voice held a mix of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "About everything." Amanda set her purse down slowly, as if buying time to think. She remained standing, creating a physical barrier between them. "I'm not sure there's anything left to say." "There's plenty," Jack said, leaning forward in the chair. "Like how I left you when you needed me most. How I chose the club over you." Amanda's shoulders tensed. "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough to forget," he countered. "I see in your eyes every time I'm here with Sophie. The hurt, the disappointment." Amanda crossed her arms, her defense mechanism showing. "What do you want from me, Jack? Forgiveness? Understanding? I want—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I want you to know how sorry I am. For everything." "Sorry doesn't change the past," Amanda said, but her voice had softened slightly. She moved to sit on the couch, maintaining distance, but no longer standing guard. "Do you know how scared I was? 22 years old, pregnant, watching you spiral deeper into that life." Jack remained standing, his hands clasped in front of him. The room felt smaller than usual, charged with unspoken words and old hurts. "I need to say something," Jack began, his voice rough but steady. "I've been thinking about everything, about who I was, who I am now, and who I want to be." Amanda sat down next to Daniel, her hands folded in her lap. Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she watched him. "I was a fool," Jack continued. "Back then, I thought being tough meant being cruel. I thought power came from making others afraid." He paused, swallowing hard. "But Sophie, she's taught me more about strength in these past few weeks than I learned in all my years with the Angels." The mention of their daughter made both parents sit up straighter. Jack pressed on, his words coming from deep within. "I'm not here asking to be Sophie's protector from monsters. Truth is, I'm the one who needed protecting, from myself, from my past." Jack's voice grew softer. "I'm here because that little girl showed me there's still good in the world, still a chance for someone like me to do better." Daniel leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "And what exactly are you asking for?" "A chance," Jack said simply. "Not to make up for the past. I know I can't do that. But to be present in Sophie's life, to show her that people can change, that monsters can become better." The room fell silent. Through the window, crickets chirped their evening song. Amanda wiped a tear from her cheek, and Daniel removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with the edge of his shirt. "You hurt a lot of people, Jack," Daniel said finally, "including Amanda." "I know," Jack acknowledged, the pain evident in his voice. "I'll carry that guilt forever. But I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I've changed. Daniel stood up, walking to the window. He stayed there for a long moment, looking out at the darkening street. When he turned back, his face had softened slightly. I don't trust easily, Daniel said, but I've seen how you are with Sophie, and I've seen how much she trusts you. He paused, sharing a look with Amanda. We'll give you a chance. One chance. Jack felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying for weeks. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was hope. And for now, that was enough. The days grew warmer as spring settled into the neighborhood. Jack had fallen into a comfortable routine with Sophie, visiting her house 3 times a week after work. Tonight, he sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, helping her organize her stuffed animals into what she called her monster patrol. Mr. Bear goes by the window, Sophie declared, placing a worn teddy bear on the windowsill. He's really good at watching for scary things. Jack smiled, handing her a small plush rabbit. And where does this little guy go? Under the bed. Sophie crawled beneath her bed frame, giggling. That's where the monsters used to hide, but now it's where my brave bunnies live. The change in Sophie over the past few weeks had been remarkable. The frightened little girl who once couldn't sleep without her lights on now bounded around her room with confidence. Every time you listen to her fears without dismissing them, you're teaching her that she's strong enough to handle whatever scares her. The tension in Jack's shoulders began to ease. He took a sip of his own hot chocolate, letting Amanda's words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers or being able to chase away every fear. Maybe it was just about being there, steady and present, helping Sophie find her own strength. The envelope felt heavy in Jack's hands as he sat at Amanda's kitchen table. His old gang's insignia was scrawled in the corner, a sight that made his stomach clench. Sophie was at school, and the house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher. Amanda stood by the counter, watching him with concerned eyes. What is it? Jack's fingers traced the edges of the unopened letter. They want me back, he said, his voice rough. I can feel it. They always reach out when they need muscle for something big. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, catching the silver in Amanda's hair. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. You haven't even opened it. Don't need to. Jack's hands trembled slightly. I know how they operate. They'll remind me of the brotherhood, the loyalty. They'll make promises. He looked up at Amanda, his eyes troubled. And part of me still wants to believe them. Amanda reached across the table and placed her hand over his. What? Jack's shoulders slumped. Because it's simple. Being there, being that person, I knew who I was. Even if I hated it sometimes, I knew my place. He pushed the envelope away. But here, with Sophie, I'm terrified of messing up. Like last night, Amanda said softly. Yeah. Jack ran a hand through his beard. When I couldn't help her with the nightmares, it hit me hard. What if I can't be what she needs? What if I fail her like I failed everyone else in my life? Amanda's grip on his hand tightened. Jack, look at me. He met her gaze reluctantly. You're not failing Sophie. You're showing up for her every day, learning how to be there for her. That's more than most people would do. But the nightmares aren't about you, Amanda interrupted. They're about Sophie growing up, facing her fears. And you're helping her do that, even when it's hard, even when you're not sure how. Jack glanced at the envelope again. With the gang, everything was black and white. You either succeeded or failed. But this, he gestured around him. Being here, trying to be better, it's all gray areas. Sometimes I don't know if I'm helping or hurting. That's called being human, Amanda said. Being part of a family isn't about always knowing the right answer. It's about showing up, trying again, loving even when it's messy. Jack's throat tightened. I want to be worthy of that, of her trust, he paused, looking at Amanda, of being part of this family. Then that's your answer. Amanda nodded toward the envelope. The gang might offer you certainty, but they can't give you what you really want, a chance to be the person Sophie believes you are. Jack sat on the edge of Sophie's bed, his large frame hunched over as she sobbed into her pillow. The night light cast soft shadows on the walls, but tonight they seemed more menacing than usual. Sophie's cries had woken him from where he dozed off on the living room couch after helping her with homework. They were bigger this time, Sophie hiccuped between sobs. The monsters. They had red eyes. Jack's heart ached. 4 weeks now, he'd been able to chase away her fears with stories and gentle reassurance. But tonight felt different. Her terrors seemed deeper, more real, and his usual methods weren't working. I thought you made them go away, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack ran a hand through his beard, feeling helpless. The weight of her disappointment pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd promised her he could handle this, promised her she'd be safe. Now here she was, shaking and crying, and nothing he said seemed to help. I'm trying, sweetheart, he said softly, patting her back. Sometimes the monsters are stubborn, but I'm still here. Sophie curled into a tighter ball, clutching her stuffed elephant. Jack felt his confidence crumbling. Maybe Daniel had been right about him all along. Maybe he wasn't cut out for this. Fighting real-world threats was one thing. He knew how to handle those. But these invisible enemies that plagued Sophie's dreams? He felt powerless against them. The bedroom door creaked open wider, and Amanda appeared in her robe, her face concerned. Everything okay in here? Jack stood up, his shoulders slumping. I can't seem to help her tonight. Nothing's working. Amanda moved past him to sit beside Sophie, smoothing her daughter's hair. Why don't you make us some hot chocolate? She suggested gently. I'll stay with her for a bit. In the kitchen, Jack's hands shook slightly as he heated the milk. He'd faced down rival gangs without flinching, but a little girl's nightmares had him questioning everything. He heard Amanda's soft voice drifting from Sophie's room, murmuring comfort and reassurance. When Amanda joined him in the kitchen a few minutes later, Sophie had finally drifted back to sleep. Jack handed her a mug of hot chocolate, avoiding her eyes. I failed her, he said quietly. I promised I'd keep the monsters away, and I couldn't do it. Amanda wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Jack, look at me. He reluctantly met her gaze. You haven't failed anyone, she said firmly. Sophie's nightmares aren't about your worth as a protector. They're just part of being a child. What matters is that you're here, that you care enough to try. But I promised. You promised to help her face her fears, Amanda interrupted. And you have. Do you know what she told me just now? She said even though the monsters were scary, she knew they couldn't really hurt her because you taught her to be brave. Jack blinked, surprised. The goal was never to make the nightmares disappear completely, Amanda continued. It was to help her feel safe enough to face them. And you've done that, Jack. Every time you show up. Well, if it ain't old Rusty, Snake said, sliding into the seat across from Jack. His weathered face broke into a crooked grin. Been a while, brother. Jack's jaw clenched. I'm not your brother anymore, Snake. That life's behind me. That's so. Snake leaned forward, lowering his voice. Word is you've gone soft, playing house with some kid and her mama. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. Got something that might interest you, though. One last job. Big score. Enough to set you up real nice. Jack's fingers tightened around his empty coffee cup. There was a time when the promise of easy money would have been all he needed to hear. The familiar rush of adrenaline tickled at the back of his neck. Not interested, Jack said firmly. Come on, man. You're wasting your talents playing nursemaid. Snake's voice took on an edge. Remember how good we were? The respect we commanded? One job, that's all I'm asking. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. Sophie's face flashed in his mind. Her trust, her innocence, her belief in him. He thought about the progress they'd made together, how she didn't wake up scared anymore. I said no. Jack's voice was quiet but firm. Snake's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Rusty. The club don't take kindly to members who forget their loyalty. I'm not a member anymore, Jack said, standing up. And my name's Jack. Snake grabbed his arm. You really think you can change who you are? You think that little girl and her mama won't see right through you eventually? Jack carefully removed Snake's hand from his arm. The only person I need to prove anything to is myself. And right now, I'm proving I'm strong enough to walk away. He pulled out his wallet and dropped a few bills on the table. As he turned to leave, Snake called after him. You'll regret this, Rusty. Mark my words. Jack walked out of the diner, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. The old pull was there, the temptation of power, money, and the brotherhood he'd once known. But it felt hollow now, like a faded photograph of something that had never been as good as he remembered. He drove straight to Sophie's house, needing to see her, to remind himself why he'd made the choice he had. As he pulled up, Amanda was working in the front garden, planting spring bulbs. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression must have caught her attention. "Everything okay?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. Jack nodded, managing a small smile. "Yeah, just had to make a choice today. Made the right one." Amanda studied his face for a moment, and he could see understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew him well enough to guess what kind of choice he meant. Her expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm gently. "Sophie's inside, doing her homework," she said quietly. "She's been waiting for you to come help her with her math." The simple acceptance in her voice, the trust it represented, meant more to Jack than all the power the club had ever offered him. He headed inside, leaving his past in the driveway where it belonged. "I've been watching you," Daniel began, crossing his arms. "With Sophie, with Amanda. I see how they've both changed since you came back." He paused, his jaw clenching. "But I need to know, really know, that this isn't temporary, that you won't disappear again when things get tough." Jack's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. The accusation in Daniel's voice sparked a familiar anger, but he pushed it down. "I'm not the same man I was," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I know I made mistakes. Huge ones. But Sophie..." He looked through the window where he could see her eating breakfast. "She gave me a chance to be better." "Words are easy," Daniel challenged. "I need more than that. Amanda was devastated when you left before. Sophie doesn't need that kind of pain in her life." Jack set his mug down on the porch railing, frustration building in his chest. "Look," he said, turning to face Daniel squarely. "I understand your doubts. Hell, I had them myself when Sophie first asked me to help her. But being here, seeing her grow stronger, watching her fears fade, it's changed me. I'm not running away this time." "And what happens when it gets hard?" Daniel pressed. "When Sophie has bad days. When Amanda needs more than just someone to chase away monsters." "Then I'll be there," Jack said firmly. "I'll be there for the nightmares and the tears, for the good days and the bad ones. I'm not asking to be her father. That's your role. But I'm asking for the chance to keep being part of her life, to keep helping her grow." Daniel studied him for a long moment, the morning silence stretching between them. Inside, they could hear Sophie laughing at something Amanda had said. "I've made plenty of mistakes," Jack continued, his voice softening. "But leaving them again won't be one of them. I promise you that." The door creaked open behind them, and Sophie bounded out onto the porch in her school uniform, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw Jack. "Jack!" she exclaimed, running toward him. "You came early." Jack knelt down as Sophie wrapped her small arms around his neck in a tight hug. He held her close, feeling the pure trust in her embrace. Looking up at Sophie's face, he said softly, "I'm not going anywhere, kiddo. I'll always be here when you need me." Daniel watched the exchange, his stern expression gradually softening. Something in Jack's words, or perhaps in the genuine affection between him and Sophie, seemed to reach him. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. For the first time since Jack had returned, he felt truly accepted. Not just by Sophie or Amanda, but by the whole family. The monsters, both Sophie's and his own, were finally beginning to fade away. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Jim's Diner as Jack finished his coffee. Through the window, he could see the familiar shape of a motorcycle pulling up outside. His stomach tightened as he recognized the rider, Snake, his old sergeant-at-arms from the Hells Angels. Snake swaggered into the diner, his leather vest covered in patches that told stories of a violent past. Heads turned as he made his way to Jack's booth, the sound of his heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Her nightmares had become less frequent, replaced by stories she made up about her stuffed animals protecting her. "You know what, kiddo?" Jack said, helping her arrange her patrol. "I think you're braver than all these stuffed animals put together." Sophie beamed at him, her missing front tooth making her smile even more endearing. "That's because you taught me how to be brave, Jack. Remember when you showed me how to check for monsters in the closet?" Jack remembered that night clearly. Instead of dismissing her fears, He'd taken her seriously, teaching her to face them head-on. They'd opened the closet door together, turned on the light, and examined every corner. He'd shown her there was nothing to fear, but had never once made her feel silly for being scared. "Want to read a story before bed?" Jack asked, reaching for their favorite book on her shelf. "Yes, the one about the friendly dragon." Sophie climbed into bed, pulling her covers up to her chin. As Jack read, he noticed Amanda standing in the doorway, watching them. Her expression was soft, thoughtful. The story finished, and Sophie's eyes began to droop. "Good night, brave girl," Jack whispered, tucking her in. "Night, Jack," Sophie murmured, already half asleep. "Love you." The words caught him off guard, making his throat tight with emotion. He patted her hand gently and stood up, quietly making his way to the door where Amanda waited. They walked downstairs together, the house quiet except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher. In the kitchen, Amanda poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the counter to Jack. "I've never seen her sleep so peacefully," Amanda said softly, wrapping her hand around her mug. "The nightmares used to be every night. Now," she shook her head in wonder. Jack took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. She just needed someone to believe in her fears, to help her face them. Amanda's eyes met his, filled with understanding. "You've changed, Jack. Really changed." Her voice was quiet but sincere. "I wasn't sure at first, but seeing you with her," she trailed off, but her meaning was clear. They stood in comfortable silence, the kitchen clock ticking softly. The tension that had existed between them since his return had melted away, replaced by something gentler. Acceptance, perhaps even forgiveness. Amanda touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being there for her, for helping her find her courage." Jack nodded, understanding passing between them. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, was finally behind them. What mattered now was the present, and the little girl sleeping peacefully upstairs who had helped heal them both. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Jack sat at the counter, drinking his coffee. He'd arrived early to help Sophie get ready for school, a routine he'd grown to cherish. The sound of footsteps made him look up. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression stern. "We need to talk," Daniel said, his voice tight with tension. He gestured toward the back porch. Jack followed him outside, the cool morning air nipping at his skin. The wooden boards creaked beneath their feet as they stood facing each other. As Amanda brought out dessert, an apple pie that filled the room with cinnamon and warmth, Jack felt something settle in his chest. It was a feeling he'd been chasing his whole life without knowing it. Peace, belonging, home. Sophie leaned against his arm, her small hand finding his. "Tell us a story, Jack. You promised." "Well," Jack began, his voice gentle. "Once there was a lonely monster who didn't know he was lonely. He wandered around, thinking he was tough and scary, until one day a brave little girl found him." "That's me." Sophie bounced in her seat. "I found you." Amanda's eyes met Jack's across the table, soft with understanding. Daniel topped off Jack's coffee, nodding encouragingly. "That's right," Jack continued, his throat tight with emotion. This little girl wasn't afraid of the monster. Instead, she asked him for help. And you know what? By helping her fight her monsters, he learned how to fight his own. "Did the monster stop being lonely?" Sophie asked, though she already knew the answer. Jack looked around the table, at Amanda's warm smile, Daniel's respectful nod, and Sophie's trusting face. He thought about that day on the street corner, how a crumpled dollar bill and a child's request had changed everything. How Sophie's innocent faith in him had given him the strength to face his past and build a future. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, pulling her close. The monster wasn't lonely anymore, because he found something better than being scary. He found a family. Sophie beamed up at him, pride shining in her eyes. "And now you protect us from all the monsters." "That's right," Jack agreed, his heart full. "Every single one." The evening light streamed through the windows, painting the room in warm gold. Jack sat back, savoring his coffee and the comfortable chatter around him. Who would have thought that the simple words of a 5-year-old, "Can you scare my monsters?" would lead him here to this moment of perfect belonging? The pot roast had long since been cleared away, but no one seemed eager to leave the warmth of the dining room. Sophie sat cross-legged in her chair, carefully coloring a picture while the adults lingered over coffee and apple pie. Jack watched her, amazed at how such a small person could have such a big impact on his life. Amanda caught his eye across the table and smiled, the kind of smile that held memories of their shared past, but also hope for their future. The evening light filtering through the curtains caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding Jack of how much time had passed since they'd first met. "Look, Jack." Sophie held up her drawing. "It's us fighting monsters together." Jack leaned over to examine the crayon masterpiece. There they were, a small stick figure with yellow pigtails and a much larger one with a brown beard. They were holding hands, facing down what looked like a purple blob with teeth. "That's a monster," Jack said seriously. "But I can tell he's no match for us." "No," Sophie beamed. "We're too strong together." Daniel reached for the coffee pot, refilling everyone's cups. "Sophie, honey, it's almost bedtime. Why don't you go get ready while we clean up?" Mickey's friendly demeanor slipped slightly. "Come on, Rusty. You really gonna throw away everything we built? For what? Playing daddy to some kid that ain't even yours." "That kid," Jack's voice hardened, "helped me find something I never had in the club. Peace. Peace." Mickey spat the word like it was poison. "Peace is for old men and cowards. You're neither, brother. You're a warrior. Always have been." Jack stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the porch boards. "I used to think that too. But real strength? It's not about violence or fear. It's about having the guts to change." Mickey rose as well, his face darkening. "You're making a mistake, Rusty. The club won't forget this." "No," Jack said quietly. "The mistake will be going back." He looked Mickey straight in the eye. "I've got something worth protecting now. Something real." Mickey stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. "You've gone soft." He started down the steps, then turned back. "When this little family fantasy falls apart, and it will, don't come crawling back to us." Jack watched as Mickey mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life. As the sound faded into the distance, he felt the weight of his choice settling over him. The pull of his old life was still there, but it was weaker now, overwhelmed by the thought of Sophie's smile and Amanda's trust. He picked up his coffee cup and went inside, closing the door firmly on his past once again. The aroma of pot roast and fresh-baked rolls filled Sophie's house. Around the dining table, plates clinked and conversations flowed easily. Jack sat between Sophie and Amanda, still amazed at how natural it felt to be here, sharing a Sunday dinner with them. "More potatoes, Jack." Daniel passed the bowl, a genuine smile on his face. It was strange how time could change things. The man who once looked at him with suspicion now treated him like family. "Thanks." Jack spooned some onto his plate, watching as Sophie tried to sneak her vegetables onto his dish when she thought no one was looking. He caught her eye and winked, making her giggle. "Sophie," Amanda said, trying to sound stern but failing to hide her smile, "eat your carrots." "But Jack likes them more than me," Sophie protested, her blue eyes wide with innocence. "Nice try, kiddo." Jack gently pushed the vegetables back on her plate. "How about this? For every carrot you eat, I'll tell you a story about defeating a monster." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Promise. Cross my heart." Jack made an X over his chest, and Sophie immediately popped a carrot into her mouth. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You got her figured out, Jack. I've been trying to get her to eat vegetables for months." "It's because Jack makes everything into an adventure," Sophie declared, proudly showing her empty fork. "That's one story you owe me." The conversation drifted easily between topics. Sophie's upcoming school play, Amanda's work at the library, Daniel's latest business project. Jack found himself sharing stories too, carefully edited versions of his travels across the country, making Sophie's eyes grow wide with wonder. Amanda crossed the room slowly, sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said quietly. "What day is that?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "The day when both our monsters would be gone." Amanda's voice wavered slightly. "When Sophie would sleep through the night without fear, And when you... She paused, collecting her thoughts. When you would finally find your way back to us. Jack stood up, moving to sit beside her on the bed. The space between them felt different now, no longer filled with pain and regret, but with understanding and possibility. I spent so long running from who I was, Jack admitted. But Sophie, she taught me how to stay, how to face things head on. Amanda reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. We've all come so far, she whispered. Sometimes I look at us now, and I can hardly believe it's real. They sat there in comfortable silence, listening to Sophie's excited chatter floating up from downstairs. The morning sun continued to pour through the window, warming their faces and casting away the last lingering shadows of their past. The room that had once been filled with Sophie's fears now held only peace and the promise of tomorrow. Jack squeezed Amanda's hand gently, grateful for this moment of quiet understanding between them. The rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through the quiet afternoon. Jack looked up from where he sat on his front porch, his coffee growing cold in his hands. A familiar figure pulled up on a gleaming Harley-Davidson. Mickey the Snake Thompson, his old road captain from the Angels. Jack's stomach tightened. Mickey hadn't changed much, still wore the same leather vest covered in patches, still had that crooked grin that meant trouble was coming. Well, Mickey called out, killing the engine. If it ain't Jack Rusty Callahan himself. He swung off the bike with the ease of someone who'd spent more time on 2 wheels than 2 feet. Living the suburban dream, I see. Jack set his coffee down, staying seated. What brings you here, Mickey? Can't a man check up on an old friend? Mickey climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wooden boards. He settled into the chair next to Jack, uninvited. Been hearing things about you, Rusty. Playing house with some woman and her kid. Her name's Amanda, Jack said firmly. And Sophie. Mickey pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offering one to Jack. When Jack shook his head, Mickey shrugged and lit one for himself. Listen, brother. The club's got something big coming up. Real big. The kind of score that sets a man up for life. Jack felt the old pull, like a hook in his gut. The adrenaline, the brotherhood, the wild freedom of the open road. It had been his life for so long. I'm not interested. Don't be so quick to say no. Mickey leaned forward, lowering his voice. 20 minutes of work, that's all we need. With your skills? Easy money. Nobody gets hurt. Jack thought of Sophie's drawing on his fridge, stick figures of him, her, and Amanda holding hands. He thought of the trust in Sophie's eyes when she fell asleep during thunderstorms, knowing he was there to keep the monsters away. The answer's still no, Jack said. How about tomorrow? Amanda suggested, tucking the blanket around her. It's getting late. Sophie nodded sleepily, already drifting off. Promise. Promise, Jack and Amanda said together. They sat there quietly, watching their daughter fall asleep. The room was peaceful, free from the shadows that had once frightened Sophie so much. Jack realized his own shadows had retreated too, replaced by the gentle certainty of belonging. Amanda's hand found his in the growing darkness. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Years of pain and misunderstanding had melted away, leaving something stronger in their place. They were no longer ex-lovers trying to navigate the past, but partners in creating a future for their daughter. Sophie's breathing deepened into sleep, and Jack felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The monsters, both real and imagined, had no power here. Not anymore. The morning sunlight streamed through Sophie's bedroom window, creating patterns on her pink bedspread. Jack sat in the small chair beside her bed, watching as she organized her stuffed animals in a neat row. Look, Sophie held up her favorite teddy bear. He's not scared anymore either. She hugged the bear close, her smile bright and genuine. And guess what? I didn't have any bad dreams last night. Jack's heart swelled with pride. That's wonderful, kiddo. Or the night before that, Sophie continued, bouncing slightly on her bed. Or the night before that one, too. She counted on her fingers. I think it's been a whole week without monsters. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. How does that feel? Sophie thought for a moment, her face scrunched in concentration. It feels good, like when you eat ice cream on a hot day. She paused, then added, The monsters aren't under my bed anymore because you scare them away forever. The simple truth in her words touched something deep inside Jack. He remembered the first day she'd approached him with that crumpled dollar bill, asking him to fight her monsters. Back then, he'd been fighting his own demons, lost in the shadows of his past. You know what, Sophie? Jack's voice was soft. You helped scare away my monsters, too. Sophie's eyes widened. I did. You sure did. Jack reached out and gently tapped her nose. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is trust someone else to help us. Like how I trusted you. Sophie climbed into his lap, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Exactly like that. Jack hugged her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. The tough exterior he'd worn for so many years had melted away, replaced by something stronger, the love of a father for his daughter. Amanda appeared in the doorway, watching them with soft eyes. She'd been standing there for a while, taking in the scene before her. Jack looked up, meeting her gaze, and saw the tears glistening in her eyes. Sophie, Amanda said, her voice gentle. Grandma's here to take you to the park. Why don't you go get ready? Sophie jumped up excitedly, grabbing her favorite jacket before running out of the room, leaving Jack and Amanda alone. Jack picked up the envelope and, without opening it, tore it in half, then in quarters. The pieces fell to the table like confetti, and with them, the weight on his chest seemed to lift. I'm never going back, he said, his voice firm. Whatever they're offering, it's not worth losing this. Amanda smiled, squeezing his hand one more time before standing up. Welcome home, Jack. The evening light cast long shadows across Sophie's bedroom floor as Jack sat on the edge of her small bed. Her favorite book, Where the Wild Things Are, lay open on his lap. The worn pages felt familiar now, after countless readings over the past months. Sophie snuggled closer to him, her stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm. Read the part about Max becoming king again, she said, pointing at the page with a small finger. Jack's voice, usually gruff, softened as he read. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. He paused, letting the words sink in. They meant something different to him now than they had before. Jack, Sophie looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes that had changed his life. Are you still scared sometimes? He closed the book slowly, considering her question. You know what? I used to be. All the time. Of monsters. Different kinds of monsters. Jack shifted to face her better. I was scared of not being good enough. Of making mistakes. But you taught me something important. Sophie sat up straighter, her face bright with curiosity. What did I teach you? That being brave isn't about not being scared. Jack tapped her nose gently. It's about facing those fears anyway. Just like you did. She beamed at him. I'm not scared of the dark anymore. Or the shadows under my bed. That's right. Jack smiled, the motion crinkling the corners of his eyes. And you know what else? The future isn't scary anymore either. Because we're family? Sophie asked, her voice hopeful. The word family caught in Jack's throat, warming him from the inside. Yeah, kiddo. Because we're family. A soft knock at the door made them both look up. Amanda stood in the doorway, still in her work clothes, but with her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked tired but happy. Room for one more? She asked. Sophie patted the space next to her. We're talking about not being scared anymore. Amanda sat down, the bed dipping slightly under their combined weight. She reached over and smoothed Sophie's hair. Is that so? Jack says the future isn't scary because we're family, Sophie reported proudly. Amanda's eyes met Jack's over their daughter's head. There's understanding there, and something more, forgiveness, acceptance, maybe even love. He's right, Amanda said softly. We are family. Jack felt the last of his old fears dissolving. The gang letter he'd torn up that morning seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. Here, in this warm room with these two people, he'd found something he never knew he was looking for. Sophie yawned, fighting to keep her eyes open. Can we read one more story? Can Jack tell me a story first? Sophie pleaded, giving her father the same look that had melted Jack's heart that first day on the street corner. One story, Amanda agreed, but then straight to bed. Sophie bounced in her seat, her face glowing with happiness. Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched her excitement. These simple moments, sharing dinner, telling stories, being part of this family, meant more to him than all his years of chasing thrills with the gang. "Remember when you first asked me to scare away your monsters?" Jack asked, pulling Sophie onto his lap. She nodded eagerly. "With my dollar. I still have it in my special box." "You do?" Jack hadn't known that. The thought of her keeping that crumpled bill touched something deep inside him. "It's my lucky dollar," Sophie explained matter-of-factly, "because it brought you to us." Amanda reached across the table and squeezed Jack's hand. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. Even Daniel looked moved, quickly hiding his expression behind his coffee cup. "Well," Jack continued, his voice rough with emotion, "that was the day I learned something important. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes they're the ones we carry inside us, like fear or loneliness or thinking we're not good enough." Sophie listened intently, her small hand resting against his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. "But you know what else I learned?" Jack asked softly. "What?" "I learned that when you face those monsters with people you love, they're not so scary anymore. They get smaller and smaller until one day it just—" He snapped his fingers. "Disappear." Sophie's eyes widened. "Like magic." "Better than magic," Jack said. "Like family." He looked around the table at these people who had become his world. Sophie with her unwavering trust, Amanda with her capacity for forgiveness, and even Daniel with his hard-won acceptance. The monsters that had haunted him for so long, guilt, shame, the fear of not being worthy, seemed to fade a little more each day in the light of their love. Sophie yawned and snuggled closer, her head heavy against his shoulder. "I'm glad you stayed, Jack," she murmured sleepily. "Me too, kiddo," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Me too. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day."